Hi guys, we have already created our very first workflow. Today in this session we are going to understand the frequently used workflow and session task properties and schedule a workflow, execute and monitor the workflow. Okay, for that let's go to the workflow manager and open the workflow which we have created in the last session. Okay, and to see the properties of the workflow, let's go to workflow and do a edit. Now it's going to open the workflow in the edit mode. You can see all the available tabs here, and like any other object you can see the workflow name, and if you want to give a description about the workflow you can give that here. And if you go to the properties tab, you will be able to see the workflow log file name. Okay, it's going to take the name of the workflow by default, and if you want to change the name you can change it here. Okay, in the workflow log file you'll be able to see the detailed information about all the activities being happen when the workflow is running. Okay, and it's going to take the default parameter for the workflow log file directory, and again if you want to change the directory you can change it here. Okay, and if you want to keep the history of the workflow runs you can use the by runs property, and if you want to keep history for 2 runs or 3 runs, okay, you can give the number here. So with this setting you are going to keep the history of the workflow logs for 3 runs, and if you want to keep the history for the entire workflow you can choose the by timestamp property. Okay, once you choose that you will be getting the workflow log with a timestamp append to it, and it's going to keep all the history of your workflow runs. Okay, and with the scheduler tab you'll be able to do the scheduling of the workflow. With the scheduling you can mention to run the workflow on a particular time or a particular day. Okay, to do the scheduling you can go to the scheduler and click on this icon. It opens up the scheduler, and like any other object you can give the scheduler name and the description about it. So I'm going to give run on every Monday, and if you go to the scheduler tab you can see the options here, and I'm going to uncheck this option because I'm going to set the scheduling option from the customize to repeat option. Okay, I'm going to choose it to run on every Monday. For that click on edit. Okay, I'm going to say run it on every Monday, run only once on a day. Click on OK, and I'm going to say run Monday at 11:30 p.m. Okay, and the workflow has to be running from today, and the workflow should be continuously running from now. So I'm going to choose this option forever. Okay, so once you give that option you can click apply. Okay, so once you come back to the workflow edit window you can see that we have set the scheduler to run customized, and you can see that it's going to be running at 11:30 p.m. and it's going to be running from there forever. Okay, so these are the main properties which we will be using very frequently in the workflow. Okay, apply. Okay, we know that the link task is used to control the execution of different tasks in the workflow, and let's see how do we do that. Okay, here I want to start the execution of the session task only if the start task is succeeded. For that what I'm going to do is like double click on the link task and say if the status of the start task is succeeded. This means that the execution of the session task is going to be starting only if the status of the start task is succeeded. Once you have this expression, click on OK. So now we have set up the workflow, and in this workflow the session task is going to be executing only if the start task is succeeded. Okay, now let's go and see the properties of session. For that do a double click on the session task. Now it's going to open the session task in the edit mode. Okay, so like any other task you can see the task name, and you have the option to rename the task name, and you can give the description about the session task. I'm going to give session to load employee name. And in the properties tab, you can see the session log file name, and in the session log you will be seeing all the detailed level information about all the activities happening while the session is running. Okay, it takes your session name as the default log file name. If you want to change that, you can change the name here. And it takes the default session log file directory, and again if you want to change that log file directory, you can change it here. Okay, and if you go to the configuration object tab, you can set up how the history of the session log file has to be saved. And if you want to keep the history of the session runs for a couple of numbers, you can change it to whatever the number you want. Here with this setting, you're going to keep the history of 3 session run logs. And if you want to keep the entire history, you can choose the session timestamp. With this setting, you're going to keep the history of all the session runs in the log file. Okay, and if you want to stop the execution of the session, if in case of any error, you can use this property. And with this setting, the session is going to stop in case of at least one error. Okay, and if you want to give the error threshold, you can increase the number here. With this setting, the workflow is going to be stopping only if the errors are 10. Okay, now let's go to the mapping tab. In the mapping tab, if you go to the connections, you can see the connection database connections which we have already set. And if you go to the target table, you can see the database connection, and you can see that two modes in which data can be loaded. So here we have the normal mode and the bulk mode. You can use the bulk mode if in case the target doesn't have any index. So with the bulk mode, the data load is going to be faster, but if there is any index, you should be using the normal mode. Okay, and here you have set up the session to insert the record, and you can update the record, and you can delete the record, and the session is going to truncate any data before it loads data into the target. Okay, and in the components tab, if you see, you can set up the pre-session and post-session commands. That means you can set up a command to run before the session is starting and after the session is completed. The post-session can be either a post-session success command or post-session failure command. The same way, you can set up a email based on the success or failure of your session. Okay, click on apply to make the changes, and okay. So with that, we have gone through all the common properties which we are using in the workflow and the session. Okay, let's do a save. Go to repository and save. Now we can see that it has validated the workflow and it is updated the workflow into the repository. Okay, now let's see what are the different ways in which we can start the workflow and execute the workflow. Okay, we know that if you go to the workflow menu, you can see the start workflow. Okay, other option, come to the workspace, do a right click and start workflow. Okay, and if in case you have a workflow which has multiple tasks and you want to execute only one of the tasks from that workflow, what you can do is like go to the task which you need to run, do a right click and do a start task. Okay, with this option, you can run only one particular task of the workflow. Okay, and using the start workflow from task option, you can start the execution of a workflow from a particular point and continue the run from there. Okay, so now let's do a right click and start the workflow. Okay, so now you can see that from the output window we can see the execution of the workflow has started. Okay, and if you go to the workflow manager, you will be able to see that the workflow succeeded. Okay, so there are a couple of other options here as well to run the workflow. If you do a right click, you have option to do a restart. Okay, so let's try what happens with the restart. Okay, so you can see that the workflow has started and succeeded. If you go to this session and do a right click and do a restart workflow from the task, it's going to start the execution of the workflow from that particular task and continue from there. Okay, and here we have the option to restart the task. With this option, it's going to restart only the particular task which you are restarting. Okay, and if you see here, I have a workflow which is being run right now. I'm going to do a right click on the workflow, okay, and I'm going to do a stop. Okay, with that stop, I can stop a workflow which is being run. Okay, and if you see once again on the right click, you have a abort option. Okay, with the abort option also you can forcefully stop the execution of the workflow. Okay, and if you see here, you can see the time frame here, and if you browse through the area, you can see the history of the execution of the workflow. Okay, and I'm going to go to a different view called task view. So here you can see the repository navigator. You can see all the workflows and the folders like what you are seeing in the Gantt chart, and here you can see the history of the workflow execution. And if you remember, we have scheduled the workflow to run every Monday at 11:30, and if you see here, status is scheduled and it's going to be running on next Monday at 11:30. Okay, and you can see the different status of the workflow, and if you scroll down, you can see that there is the workflow is stop status, which we just stopped, and we can see that there is a different workflow which is also scheduled, and that's going to be running at 8 p.m. Okay, and let's look at how do we see the workflow log file and session log file. Okay, and to see the workflow log file, let's click on this workflow, and let's come back to this menu icon and click on workflow log. So now we can see that the workflow log is open, and you can see that the details about the workflow execution. And if you see here, you can see that the execution is starting, and here if you see that it's validating the condition in the link task. Okay, and since the link task is succeeded, it's going to execute the session task, and at the last you can see that the execution of the workflow is completed. Okay, just close it, and if you want to see the session log, you can open the workflow and click on the session name, and again go back to the menu and click on the session log. Okay, now we can see that it opens up the session log, and you can see the timestamp on which the activity is happening, and you can see the severity of each information. Okay, and if in case there is any error, you are going to see this as error, and if you scan through, you'll be able to see different information. And here if you see here, you can see the SQL which is being fired to the source table, and if you scroll down, you can see the target table which you are going to load, and if you scroll down, you'll be able to see how much records are returned to the target table. And here you can see that the number of records inserted are 4. Okay, and here at the bottom you can see the summary of the session run. Okay, it read 4 records from the source and returned 4 records in the target. Okay, and if you want to see the properties of the session, you can just click on here and go to the properties. Then you're going to see the details here. Okay, so here you can see the details about the session. This is about the name and some other details. And if you go to the source and target stats, you can see how many records are being read from the source, how many returned to the target, and what's the throughput, and how many bytes, and when the session started and when it is ended. Okay, in the same way you'll be able to see the properties of the workflow as well. Okay, here you can see the details of the workflow. Okay, that's all guys. Please go to my Facebook page. You'll be able to get a list of training session, training manual, lab guide, and much more information exclusively for the fans. Thank you guys. See you again for the next video. Bye bye.